Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into the Syrian civil war.
Yeah.
A conflict that you're interested in understanding better. And it's complex. It's been going on for over a decade. And honestly, it can feel overwhelming to even know where to start.
Yeah, it really is.
But that's what we're here for.
And that's what we're here for.
To kind of unpack all this stuff, right?
Right.
So, we've got some great sources here.
We do.
Historical accounts, expert analysis.
Lots of different perspectives.
Really to help us understand how a country seemingly stable could erupt into such a devastating war.
Yeah, and I think to really do that, we need to go back to 2011 and even earlier.
Yeah, rewind to Syria before 2011.
Right.
What I'm getting for these sources is that there were a lot of problems brewing under the surface.
There were, yeah.
Right. It wasn't as peaceful as it might have seemed to the outside world.
Exactly. One key factor to understand is that Syria had a long history of inequality.
Okay.
Think economic disparities, tensions between different religious groups.
Oh.
So you've got Sunni Muslims, Alawites, Druze, Christians.
Wow. So it's a very diverse place.
It is a very diverse place.
Okay.
They were all there, but the power balance wasn't exactly even.
Okay. So you're saying these inequalities played a role in setting the stage for the conflict.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a sudden explosion in 2011.
Precisely. And for example, the French Mandate era, which ended in 1946, actually sowed some of these divisions.
Oh, interesting.
And then you have the Assad regime, first Hafez al-Assad, then his son Bashar, who ruled through a system that, on the surface, looked like it kept things stable. But underneath it really favored certain groups.
Ah, you're talking about the patronage system.
That's right.
Where loyalty to the regime brought you benefits, but that obviously leaves a lot of people out in the cold.
That's it. And those who felt excluded and marginalized, their resentment built up over time, which helps us understand why the events of 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings, had such a profound impact on Syria.
Right, the Arab Spring. Everyone was talking about it back then.
Yeah, it was a very hopeful time for a lot of people.
Yeah. Tunisia, Egypt.
Yeah.
But Assad, he seemed to dismiss it, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
There's that quote from his interview.
Yeah, there is. In early 2011, Assad told the Wall Street Journal, Syria is stable.
Oh.
Knowing what we know now, that statement is almost unbelievable, isn't it?
It really is. And then, boom, the Durée protests erupt.
And what's fascinating about Durée is that it started with something seemingly small.
Okay.
The arrest and torture of some children.
Wow.
Who had painted anti-regime graffiti.
Wow. So kids spray painting gets a brutal response.
Yes.
And that triggers mass protests. It sounds like the regime severely miscalculated how much anger was simmering beneath the surface.
Yeah, their brutal crackdown on those initial protests just poured gasoline on the fire.
Oh, wow.
Instead of quelling dissent.
Right.
It escalated the situation. Wow.
Turning peaceful protests into armed rebellion.
And as things spiraled, new players emerged on the scene, right?
They did.
I'm thinking of the Free Syrian Army, or FSA, as I see it shortened in our sources.
Yes, the FSA.
Okay.
They were initially composed of soldiers who defected from the Syrian army.
Oh, wow.
Rejecting Assad's orders to fire on civilians.
So these were people who were supposed to be enforcing Assad's rule.
Exactly.
But decided that they couldn't do it anymore.
They couldn't do it anymore.
Okay.
And they quickly became a key player in the armed opposition.
But from what I'm reading, even the opposition wasn't united.
You're right. One of the defining features of this war is how fragmented the opposition was.
Okay.
You had the FSA, but also other groups, each with their own leaders, ideologies, and goals.
Wow, okay.
For example, the Syrian National Council, or SNC, emerged as a political opposition group trying to present a united front.
Okay.
But even they struggled with internal divisions. So even in opposing Assad, there wasn't one clear path forward.
It was a messy situation from the start, and to make things even more complex, external powers started taking sides, turning a domestic uprising into an international proxy war.
Hold on, let's pause there.
Okay.
Because that's a huge turning point.
It is, absolutely. We're talking about the U.S., Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all with their own agendas and vying for influence in the region. The Syrian conflict became a chessboard for global power plays with devastating consequences for the Syrian people. And these external players weren't just offering political support. They poured weapons and funding into the conflict, fueling the violence and further dividing the opposition.
So it's not just about different groups fighting Assad.
Right.
Now they're potentially fighting each other, too.
Exactly.
Wow. I can see how this just adds layers of complexity.
It does.
To an already volatile situation.
Yeah, it becomes incredibly difficult to even talk about a solution.
Right.
When the players and goals are constantly shifting. And of course, in the midst of all this chaos, a new and terrifying force emerges. ISIS. That was a turning point. It was.
That really shook the world.
Yeah.
Here's a group that seemed to come out of nowhere. But these sources suggest that the Syrian civil war actually created the perfect breeding ground for them.
That's a crucial point, yeah.
Yeah.
The power vacuum in Syria, the fractured opposition, the regional instability.
Right.
It all created this fertile ground for extremist groups like ISIS to thrive.
So they exploited the chaos, essentially.
Yeah.
I'm remembering those horrific headlines.
Yeah.
The brutal violence, the territorial gains they were making. It felt like a whole new war was erupting.
It did.
Within the existing one.
And it added a whole new level of complexity to the conflict, a whole new set of challenges for the international community. Containing ISIS became a priority for many countries, further intertwining their interests with the Syrian conflict.
It's a terrifying illustration of how internal conflicts can spiral outward with repercussions far beyond a country's borders.
Absolutely.
And on that note, these sources also highlight the Syrian refugee crisis, which became a defining feature of the war.
Absolutely. As the fighting intensified and ISIS brutality grew, millions of Syrians were forced to flee their homes. It was a mass exodus, with people risking their lives to seek safety in neighboring countries and beyond.
I remember the images of overcrowded boats, desperate families, and the sheer scale of human suffering.
It was really hard to watch.
Yeah, it felt like the world was witnessing a tragedy unfold in real time.
It was a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions. Neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan bore the brunt of this exodus, struggling to cope with the influx of refugees.
And this crisis didn't just impact the region. It had ripple effects across Europe and even further afield.
It did.
As countries grappled with how to respond to the influx of refugees and the political and social challenges it brought.
It became a global issue, raising questions about responsibility, compassion, and the limits of international cooperation.
Looking back, it's almost hard to grasp the sheer scale and complexity of this conflict.
It's a lot to take in.
It's like a tangled web with so many threads. It's hard to know where one ends and another begins.
It really is, and we haven't even touched upon the economic consequences. Syria's economy, already fragile before 2011, was completely devastated by the war. Sanctions imposed by the international community further crippled the country, leading to widespread poverty and hardship.
So even if the fighting were to stop tomorrow, rebuilding Syria would be a monumental task.
Absolutely. The physical destruction is immense.
But the social and economic scars run even deeper. It's going to take generations to heal the wounds of this conflict.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
And it makes you wonder about the long-term consequences, not just for Syria, but for the region and the world as a whole.
The Syrian civil war is a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict, the fragility of peace, and the interconnectedness of our world.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. And before we wrap up,
I'm
really struck by something else that keeps popping up in these sources. It's the role of social media in this conflict.
Yes. Social media was a game changer in the Syrian civil war. It played a crucial role in both fueling the uprising and shaping the narrative of the conflict.
From what I'm reading, it was almost revolutionary.
It was.
For years, the Assad regime controlled the flow of information, censoring the media and silencing dissent.
But social media gave ordinary Syrians a voice.
It did.
A platform to share their experiences, organize protests, and connect with the outside world.
It was a powerful tool for citizen journalism, for challenging the regime's propaganda, and for mobilizing support both within Syria and internationally. Images and videos of the protests, the crackdown, the violence, they spread like wildfire across social media platforms, bringing the reality of the conflict to a global audience.
It's almost hard to imagine this kind of uprising happening.
I know.
Even a decade earlier.
Right.
Before Facebook and Twitter.
It's true.
Yeah.
The Syrian uprising really showcased the potential of social media to empower citizens, to challenge authoritarian regimes, and to shape the course of events.
It's not a simple story.
It's not, no.
These sources also point out that social media wasn't just used for good.
Right.
It was also a weapon in the information war.
Exactly, the regime. And later groups like ISIS quickly learned how to use social media for their own purposes.
Okay.
They spread misinformation, manipulated public opinion, and even used it to recruit fighters.
So it's a double-edged sword.
It is.
This incredible tool for communication and connection.
Yeah.
But also a platform for propaganda and manipulation.
It's a complex issue, and the Syrian civil war provides a really interesting case study for understanding the power and the perils of social media in conflict.
It certainly makes you think about the role these platforms play in shaping our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
And the responsibility they have
to
ensure they're not being used to incite violence or spread hatred.
It's a conversation we need to keep having, especially as these platforms continue to evolve and their influence grows.
Now, you know, we've talked a lot about the external forces shaping the conflict.
Yes.
But I'm curious to dive deeper into the key players within Syria. It's important to remember that at the heart of this war are real people making decisions, taking actions.
Absolutely.
Fighting for their beliefs.
I agree. And there are so many fascinating individuals and groups whose stories are intertwined with this conflict. Let's start with Bashar al-Assad himself.
Okay. Assad?
Yeah.
He inherited the presidency from his father in 2000.
He did.
In the beginning, there was some hope for reform, a move away from the authoritarianism that had defined his father's rule.
Yeah.
But when the protests erupted in 2011, he reacted with brutal force,
Just dead.
Crushing dissent and showing a willingness to cling to power at any cost.
It's a tragic example of how power can corrupt.
How
good intentions can be eroded by fear and the desire to maintain control.
And surrounding Assad was this inner circle.
Yes.
Largely composed of Alawite elites who benefited from the existing power structure. They saw the uprising as a threat to their privileged position and rallied around Assad to protect their interests.
The Alawite community, a minority sect in Syria, had long been favored by the Assad regime. They held key positions in the government, the military, and the economy. So when the uprising started, they felt like they had a lot to lose.
And then, of course, there are the Syrian security forces, the ones carrying out the regime's orders. From what I'm gathering, they were brutal and ruthless in their crackdown.
They were.
Using tactics that can only be described as horrific.
The Syrian security forces had a long history of repression, dating back to Hafez al-Assad's rule. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and utterly loyal to the regime. They were the iron fist of the state. And they used that fist without mercy.
There are countless accounts of torture, arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial killings.
It's a very dark chapter.
Yeah, it's truly chilling to read about. The level of violence they unleashed on their own people.
Their brutality played a major role in turning peaceful protests into armed rebellion. It was a classic case of state violence backfiring. Creating more instability and pushing people to take up arms in self-defense.
And on the other side, you have this incredibly diverse and fractured opposition, right?
Yes.
We talked about the FSA, the SNC, but there were so many other groups involved. Each with their own motivations and goals.
Exactly. You had secular groups who wanted a democratic, pluralistic Syria. You had Islamist groups who envisioned a state based on Islamic law. You had Kurdish groups fighting for autonomy and self-determination, and you had countless smaller factions, often shifting alliances and battling each other as much as they were fighting the regime.
It sounds like an incredibly chaotic and confusing landscape.
It was.
How on earth do you even begin to navigate that? As an outsider trying to understand what's happening.
It's a real challenge. And honestly, it's part of what makes this conflict so difficult to resolve.
Right.
There are so many competing interests, so many different visions for the future of Syria that finding common ground seems almost impossible.
And then, of course, you have the rise of ISIS.
Yes.
Which adds a whole other layer of complexity and horror to the mix.
The emergence of ISIS really highlights the dangers of prolonged conflict and instability. They exploited the chaos, preying on the desperation and disillusionment of many Syrians, offering a twisted vision of order and purpose that appealed to some in the midst of unimaginable suffering.
Their brutality was shocking.
It was.
Even in the context of a brutal war.
Yeah.
And their ideology, their goal of establishing a caliphate, terrified the world.
Their rise was a turning point. A stark reminder of the global implications of the Syrian civil war.
Right.
It forced the international community to confront the threat of transnational terrorism head-on and to grapple with the unintended consequences of their involvement in the conflict.
And as we've seen, the Syrian civil war wasn't just a domestic issue.
No, it wasn't.
It had profound regional and global implications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's shift gears now and take a closer look at those external players.
Okay.
The countries that became entangled in this conflict.
Right.
Each with their own agendas and motivations.
It's crucial to understand their involvement, their actions, and their calculations because they ultimately shape the trajectory of the war.
Let's start with Russia.
Okay.
They've been a staunch ally of the Assad regime throughout the conflict, haven't they?
They have. Russia's relationship with Syria goes back decades to the Cold War era. They've long seen Syria as a strategic ally in the region. And they've maintained a naval base there for years.
So it's not just about supporting Assad personally.
No.
It's about geopolitics.
Right.
About maintaining their influence in the Middle East.
Exactly. Russia sees the U.S. influence in the region as a threat, and they're determined to counter it. They also view the Syrian regime as a bulwark against what they perceive as Western attempts to destabilize the region and promote regime change.
And they were willing to put their money where their mouth is?
They were.
So to speak.
Yes.
They provided Assad with military support, diplomatic cover, and economic assistance throughout the war.
Their intervention was crucial in turning the tide of the conflict in Assad's favor.
Wow.
Russian airstrikes, for example, played a decisive role in helping the regime regain control of key territories.
It's interesting, though, because while Russia was all in on supporting Assad, the U.S. took a much more cautious approach, didn't they?
They did. The U.S. was initially hesitant to get too deeply involved in the Syrian conflict. They were wary of another protracted military entanglement in the Middle East. Especially after the long and costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Plus, there was this real fear of unintended consequences, wasn't there?
There was.
Arming the rebels could backfire.
Right.
Especially with the presence of extremist groups like ISIS.
Exactly.
And direct military intervention could escalate the conflict. Potentially drawing in other regional powers and leading to a wider war.
Those were all very real concerns. The U.S. policy was a balancing act, trying to support the opposition without getting sucked into a full-blown war.
So they ended up providing some support to select rebel groups.
They did.
Nothing on the scale of what Russia was doing for Assad.
Exactly. And this led to criticism from some who argued that the U.S. wasn't doing enough to help the Syrian people or to counter Assad's brutality.
It's a complex situation.
It is.
And there are no easy answers.
No.
But I think it's clear that the U.S. and Russia, these two global superpowers, ended up playing a decisive role.
They did.
In shaping the course of the Syrian civil war, even if their goals and approaches were vastly different.
And they weren't the only external players. The region itself was deeply affected by the conflict. And countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey all became embroiled in the feeding, pursuing their own interests, and adding to the complexity of the situation.
Let's talk about Iran first.
Okay.
They were staunch supporters of Assad, weren't they?
Absolutely. Iran and Syria have a long-standing alliance, rooted in their shared opposition to Israel and the U.S. Iran sees the Assad regime as a crucial link in what they call the axis of resistance, a network of allies stretching from Tehran to Beirut.
So for Iran, supporting Assad wasn't just about Syria itself.
Yeah, it was.
It was about maintaining their regional influence and countering their rivals, primarily Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. Iran provided Assad with financial aid, military advisors, and even sent troops to fight alongside Syrian government forces. They also facilitated the involvement of Hezbollah, a powerful Lebanese militia group that's closely allied with Iran.
And Hezbollah's involvement was significant, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
They're a battle-hardened fighting force.
Right.
And their presence on the ground really bolstered the Assad regime.
They were a game changer for Assad, especially in the early years of the conflict, when the Syrian army was struggling to contain the rebellion.
So you have Iran and Hezbollah on one side, backing Assad, and then on the other side you have Saudi Arabia, who are essentially backing the rebels, right?
That's right. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as its main regional rival, and they're locked in a proxy war across the Middle East, vying for influence and control.
Okay.
The Syrian civil war became another battleground in this larger conflict.
And Saudi Arabia wasn't shy about supporting the rebels, were they?
No, they weren't.
They provided funding, weapons, and training to various opposition groups, hoping to topple Assad and weaken Iran's grip on the region.
They saw Assad's fall as a major victory, a way to roll back Iranian influence and reassert their own dominance in the region.
But it wasn't just about geopolitics for Saudi Arabia.
Right.
They also had their own internal concerns, didn't they?
They did.
The potential spread of Shia Islam, which is Iran's dominant religious sect, was seen as a threat to the Saudi monarchy.
It was.
Which is based on Sunni Islam.
Exactly. The sectarian dimension of the conflict was very real for Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
They feared that a Shia-dominated government in Syria would embolden their own Shia minority and potentially destabilize the kingdom.
So you have Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
These two regional heavyweights.
Yes.
Locked in a proxy war within Syria.
That's right.
Each pursuing their own interests and using the conflict to further their larger goals.
Exactly.
And then you have Turkey.
Yes.
A country that's always played a complex role in the region. What were their motivations?
Turkey's involvement in the Syrian civil war is particularly fascinating because it evolved over time. Initially, they had good relations with Assad. And were even seen as potential mediators in the conflict.
Oh, wow.
But that all changed pretty quickly, didn't it?
It did.
As the violence escalated and the refugee crisis began to spill over into Turkey, their stance towards Assad hardened.
And they had their own security concerns, didn't they?
It did.
The rise of Kurdish groups in northern Syria.
Yes.
Was a major red flag for Turkey.
Absolutely. Turkey has a large Kurdish population of its own. And they've been fighting a separatist insurgency for decades.
Right.
They view the Kurdish groups in Syria as a direct threat to their national security.
Right.
Fearing that they'll create an independent Kurdish state on their border.
Wow.
And inspire further unrest within Turkey.
So Turkey's involvement in the Syrian civil war was driven by a mix of factors.
Yes.
Their opposition to Assad. Refugee crisis.
Right.
And their determination to prevent the Kurds from gaining too much power.
Exactly. They provided support to various rebel groups. Allowed foreign fighters to transit through their territory.
Wow.
And even launched military incursions into northern Syria. To target Kurdish forces.
It's amazing how this one conflict drew in so many different players, each with their own agendas, fears, and ambitions.
Yeah.
And in the end, it's the Syrian people who paid the highest price.
Absolutely. The Syrian civil war is a tragedy of epic proportions.
Yeah.
Millions displaced.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands killed. A country shattered.
Wow.
And it's a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked violence.
Right.
The failure of diplomacy and the human cost of geopolitical gamesmanship.
It's been a heavy conversation.
It has.
But an important one.
I agree.
We've explored the roots of the conflict. The key players, the pivotal moments, the regional and global implications.
Absolutely.
We've looked at the role of social media, the refugee crisis, the economic devastation. But we can't end this deep dive without addressing the humanitarian crisis.
Right.
That unfolded in Syria.
Yeah.
A crisis that continues to this day.
It does.
And that's what we'll focus on.
Okay.
In the final part of our exploration.
The humanitarian crisis in Syria is truly staggering, you know?
And
we're talking about a level of suffering that's hard to even comprehend.
Yeah.
Millions of people displaced, countless lives lost, entire cities reduced to rubble. It's a catastrophe that's touched every aspect of Syrian society.
It's overwhelming to even think about, where do we even begin to unpack something this massive?
Maybe with the role of the United Nations.
Okay.
They've been trying to do what they can, brokering peace talks, delivering aid. But their efforts have been hampered by so many obstacles.
Yeah.
The sheer complexity of the conflict, the constant fighting, the lack of cooperation from the warring parties, and the political gridlock in the UN Security Council.
I'm remembering how often the Security Council was paralyzed.
Yes.
By those vetoes from Russia and China.
Right.
It felt like every time there was a glimmer of hope for some kind of international action, it would just get shut down.
It was incredibly frustrating to watch.
Yeah.
And the Syrian people were caught in the middle.
Right.
Their suffering politicized and used as leverage in these geopolitical power struggles.
And it wasn't just the UN struggling to make a difference.
Right.
These sources highlight the incredible work of humanitarian organizations.
Yes.
Groups like the Red Cross.
Yeah.
Doctors Without Borders.
Absolutely.
And countless others working tirelessly on the ground to alleviate the suffering.
They're the true heroes of this story.
Yeah.
They're the ones risking their lives to deliver aid, provide medical care, shelter the displaced, and offer a glimmer of hope in the darkest of times.
From what I'm reading, they faced incredible challenges.
They did.
Imagine trying to deliver aid in a war zone.
Yes.
Where bombs are falling, where you're constantly navigating checkpoints and negotiating with armed groups, where you're never truly safe.
It's a testament to their courage and dedication that they were able to achieve anything at all.
Right.
And yet they were often targeted by the warring parties.
Wow.
Their convoys attacked, their hospitals bombed.
It's heartbreaking, and it really highlights the erosion of respect.
It does.
For international humanitarian law.
Yeah.
You're supposed to protect aid workers, hospitals, civilians.
Absolutely.
These are fundamental principles of warfare.
They are.
But they were so often disregarded in Syria.
It really raises the question, what is the international community's responsibility when faced with a humanitarian crisis of this magnitude? Do we have a moral obligation to intervene to protect civilians, even when it's politically risky or militarily challenging?
These are tough questions.
They are.
With no easy answers.
No.
But I think this deep dive has shown us that we can't just turn away from suffering on this scale.
We can't.
We have to find ways to work together.
Yeah.
To hold perpetrators accountable.
Absolutely.
To demand better from our leaders.
Right.
And to support those working on the ground.
Yes.
To alleviate the pain.
I agree, and while the big picture can feel overwhelming, it's important to remember that behind the statistics, behind the headlines, are individual human beings. Each one with their own story, their own dreams, their own losses.
Reading these accounts, I'm struck by the resilience of the Syrian people.
Me too.
Even in the face of unimaginable hardship, they found ways to help each other. To rebuild their lives, to hold on to hope.
It's a testament to the human spirit. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always a flicker of light, a reason to believe that a better future is possible.
I think that's an important message to end on.
It is.
This deep dive has been a journey into one of the most complex and tragic conflicts of our time.
It really has.
We've explored the political, social, economic, and humanitarian dimensions of the Syrian civil war.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We've examined the roles of internal and external players. The rise and fall of groups like ISIS.
Absolutely.
The devastating refugee crisis. And the erosion of international norms.
It's been a lot to process.
Yeah.
But I think it's essential to engage with these difficult issues. The Syrian civil war is a stark reminder of the fragility of peace, the interconnectedness of our world, and the human cost of conflict.
And it's a call to action.
It is.
To learn from the mistakes of the past.
Yeah.
To demand better from our leaders.
Absolutely.
To support those working for peace and justice.
Right.
And to never lose sight of our shared humanity.
Because ultimately, the Syrian civil war is not just a Syrian tragedy. No. It's a global tragedy. And it's up to all of us to work together to prevent such horrors from happening again.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
I hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and ultimately a catalyst for positive change.